The Atlantic Ocean is a place of infinite scale, a wilderness that rarely yields its secrets once it has claimed them. In the early months of 1918, the world was already consumed by a different kind of scale, the industrial slaughter of the Great War. Millions of men were entrenched in the mud of Europe, and the sea was a battlefield of silent predators. Yet, amidst the chaos of torpedoes and naval blockades, one event occurred that defied the logic of warfare and the laws of probability. It began with a vessel that seemed almost too large to fail. The USS Cyclops was not a fragile transport or a nimble scout. It was a 5-4 2-foot-long Proteus-class collier, a steel leviathan designed to fuel the American fleet. On its final voyage, it carried 306 souls and over 10,000 tons of manganese ore, a vital component for the creation of steel used in the war effort. It was a ship that represented the industrial might of a rising superpower. But on a clear day in March, it simply ceased to exist. There was no distress call, no debris field, no oil slick. One moment, the Cyclops was a tangible presence on the horizon. The next, it was a ghost. To this day, the disappearance remains the single largest non-combat loss of life in U.S. naval history. But as the decades have passed, the focus has shifted from the tragedy of the men lost to the mechanical and psychological mysteries that preceded the final silence. Because while the ocean provides a convenient shroud, the records suggest that the seeds of the Cyclops' destruction were sown long before it entered the open water. To understand what happened to the Cyclops, one must first look at the vessel itself. It was a massive, ungainly structure, characterized by its towering derricks, a skeletal forest of steel arms used to move coal in a photograph from the era. The ship looks less like a sleek military vessel and more like a floating factory, heavy and utilitarian. By 1918, however, the Cyclops was showing signs of fatigue. It had been in service for 7 years, and reports from the time hint at a ship that was struggling to keep pace with the demands of a world at war. The journey began in Rio de Janeiro. The mission was straightforward: transport the manganese ore to Baltimore. But the ship was already compromised. One of its 2 engines was non-functional, a cracked cylinder having rendered it useless. This meant the Cyclops was limping, moving at a reduced speed, and lacking the flash maneuverability it might need should the weather turn or an enemy appear. Yet, the decision was made to proceed. Some historians believe the pressure of the war effort outweighed the risks of a mechanical failure. In a time of global conflict, caution was often a luxury that naval commanders felt they could not afford. But that wasn't the strangest part of the ship's departure. As the Cyclops prepared to leave Brazilian waters, there was a growing sense of unease among the crew, though not because of the engine. The source of the tension was the man on the bridge, Lieutenant Commander George W. Worley. Worley was an eccentric figure, even by the standards of the early 20th century Navy. Born in Germany as Johann Friedrich Wichmann, he had changed his name and spent years navigating the merchant marine before commissioning. He was known for his erratic behavior, often walking the decks in a heavy overcoat and a derby hat, regardless of the heat. He was a strict, often abrasive, disciplinarian, and rumors circulated that his loyalties might be conflicted given his German heritage. While there is no evidence to suggest he was a saboteur, His leadership created a pressurized environment within the hull of the ship as the vessel moved northward, heavily laden and underpowered. The atmosphere on board was thick with more than just the tropical heat. Records indicate that several crew members were under arrest or in the brig for various infractions. A 22 sign of a ship in a state of internal friction, and that's when things began to shift. On March 3rd, 1918, the Cyclops made an unscheduled stop in Barbados. It was an odd choice. The ship had enough coal and water to make it to its destination, yet Worley insisted on pulling into port. He claimed the ship was overloaded and riding too low in the water, but instead of offloading cargo, he took on more supplies. The American consul in Barbados, Brockholst Livingston, noted that the ship seemed dangerously deep in the water, well below its load line. He sent a telegram to the State Department expressing his concern, noting the captain's peculiar behavior and the vessel's precarious state. Livingston's dispatch read like a warning from a man who sensed an impending disaster. He mentioned that the Cyclops was unusually deep and that the morale of the crew seemed shattered. But the warning arrived too late to change the course of history. On March 4th, the Cyclops raised its anchor and steamed out of the harbor, heading toward the northern horizon. It was the last time the fly-in-towed ship would ever be seen by eyes on land. What they found next changed the narrative entirely, or rather, what they didn't find. When the Cyclops failed to arrive in Baltimore on its scheduled date of March 13th, the Navy didn't immediately panic. Wireless telegraphy was still in its relative infancy, and it wasn't uncommon for ships to be delayed by weather or mechanical issues. But as days turned into weeks, the silence became deafening. The Navy launched a massive search operation, scouring the route from the Caribbean to the Chesapeake Bay. Every available ship and aircraft was deployed. They looked for the telltale signs of a disaster: lifeboats, life jackets, or the floating bodies of the 306 men. They found nothing. Not a single piece of the ship, no matter how small, ever washed ashore. For a 19,000-ton steel ship to vanish without leaving a trace is a statistical anomaly that defies the typical patterns of maritime accidents. Even ships sunk by torpedoes or sudden explosions usually leave behind a debris field, a smear of oil, a wooden crate, a sailor's cap. The Cyclops left the world as if it had never existed. In the months following the disappearance, the investigation took a dark turn. The Office of Naval Intelligence began to look closely at George Worley. They delved into his past, searching for any link to German espionage. At the time, the U-boat peril was the primary fear of every Allied sailor. The idea that a German-born captain might have handed his ship over to the enemy, or perhaps even scuttled it to prevent the manganese from reaching American steel mills, was a theory that gained significant traction. However, there is no clear consensus on this. If the ship had been captured, it would have had to be taken to a neutral or German-controlled port, and no record of the Cyclops ever surfaced in the German archives after the war. If it had been scuttled, why would there be no survivors? Why would a captain sacrifice himself along with his crew for a cargo of ore? The theory of betrayal, while compelling to a public gripped by wartime paranoia, lacked the physical evidence to sustain itself. But as investigators moved away from the human element, they began to uncover structural secrets that suggested the ship was its own worst enemy. The Proteus-class colliers had a design flaw that few wanted to acknowledge at the height of the war. These ships were built with a long, continuous hold, and their structural integrity relied on a series of beams that were susceptible to corrosion, especially when carrying heavy, abrasive cargo like manganese ore. Recent analysis by marine architects suggests that a single catastrophic failure of the hull could have caused the ship to fold in on itself like a piece of paper. If the ship's keel had snapped in a heavy swell, the Cyclops would have gone down in seconds, not minutes. This would explain the lack of a distress call. The wireless room would have been underwater before the operator could even reach for the key. Yet, this explanation assumes the ship encountered a storm significant enough to break its back. And the weather reports from the first week of March 1918 tell a story that doesn't quite fit the narrative of a violent, ship-breaking tempest. Meteorological records from the Caribbean in early March 1918 tell a three bows the threesist, surprisingly quiet story. While the Atlantic is known for its sudden, violent swells, the logs from nearby vessels and coastal stations suggest that the weather, while perhaps choppy, was not indicative of a ship-killing storm. This discrepancy creates a haunting question. If the sea was not the primary aggressor, what caused a 500-foot steel giant to succumb so completely? The answer may lie not in the wind or the waves, but in the very cargo the Cyclops was tasked with carrying. Manganese ore is a deceptive substance. It is incredibly dense, significantly heavier than the coal the ship was originally designed to transport. When a ship is loaded with such a concentrated weight, its center of gravity shifts. It becomes stiff, a nautical term for a vessel that snaps back upright too quickly after rolling in a wave. This creates immense structural stress, a rhythmic, violent jerking that can tear at the very rivets holding the hull together. But there was another, more insidious danger hidden in the hold. Manganese ore has a tendency to shift if not properly secured. If the cargo had moved even a few feet to one side during a routine roll, the Cyclops would have developed a permanent list. In its weakened state, with one engine out and the hull already riding dangerously low, a sudden shift in weight would have been a death sentence. But the mystery of the cargo wasn't the only thing weighing on the ship. As the investigation deepened in the years after the war, a new and unsettling pattern began to emerge, one that suggested the Cyclops wasn't an isolated tragedy, but a symptom of a much larger flaw. In the decades that followed, two of the Cyclops' sister ships, the USS Proteus and the USS Nereus, also vanished without a trace in the same general region of the Atlantic. Both were carrying heavy loads of metallic ore. Both disappeared during World War II, initially leading many to blame German U-boats. However, German records once again showed no claims for the sinkings. The realization began to dawn on naval historians that these ships shared more than just a design. They shared a fatal vulnerability. The Proteus-class colliers were built with a specific type of experimental I-beam construction. Over time, the acidic nature of the coal and the corrosive sea air could eat away at these beams, particularly in the areas that were difficult to inspect. If the Cyclops had been rotting from the inside out, the heavy manganese ore would have been the catalyst for a sudden, catastrophic structural failure. In this scenario, the ship didn't sink. It disintegrated. Yet, even a structural failure usually leaves something behind. The total absence of debris remains the most difficult piece of the puzzle to reconcile. It suggests a descent so rapid that nothing had the chance to float free. No wooden lifeboats were launched, no crates of supplies bobbed to the surface, and no life jackets were donned. It was as if the ocean had simply opened its mouth and swallowed the ship whole. And that's when the investigation took an even more personal turn. Among the 306 people on board was a passenger who didn't belong to the crew. Alfred Louis. Moreau Gottschalk was the U.S. Consul General in Rio de Janeiro. He was a high-ranking diplomat, a man of significant influence, and his presence on the Cyclops has been a subject of intense scrutiny for over a century. Gottschalk had reportedly expressed a strange urgency to return to the United States. Like Captain Worley, Gottschalk had faced rumors regarding his loyalties. Some reports suggested he had been overly friendly with German sympathizers in Brazil. His decision to board a limping, overloaded cargo ship instead of a faster, safer passenger vessel was seen by some as suspicious. Was he carrying information? Was he attempting to flee? Or was he simply a man trying to get home during a time of global upheaval? What they found next changed the narrative entirely. Decades after the disappearance, a deep-sea diver named Dean Hawes claimed to have stumbled upon a massive wreck off the coast of Virginia in the 1960s. He described a ship that matched the unique profile of a Proteus-class collier lying in deep water, its giant derrick arms reaching up like skeletal fingers. However, before a formal expedition could be mounted, a storm shifted the sands of the seabed, and the Foch wreck, if it was indeed the Cyclops, was lost once again to the darkness. This tantalizing lead only added to the frustration of the search. Without a wreck to examine, historians are left to piece together the final moments from fragments of testimony and the cold logic of physics. If the ship did indeed succumb to a structural failure, the experience for those on board would have been a nightmare beyond comprehension. Imagine the scene. A moonless night in the Atlantic. The ship is laboring against a moderate swell. The rhythmic thrum of its single functioning engine, the only sound against the wind. Below decks, the rivets are groaning under the weight of 10,000 tons of ore. Suddenly, a sound like a gunshot rings out the snapping of a main structural beam. Within seconds, the keel buckles. The sea rushes into the holds, the air escaping in a violent hiss that would have been the only distress call the ship ever made. But even this logical progression of events doesn't explain everything. There is no record of the ship's wireless operator, a man named G.W. Anderson, ever attempting to send a signal. Even in a fast-sinking scenario, the SOS of the era could be sent in a matter of seconds. The silence of the Cyclops radio suggests that whatever happened was so instantaneous that it bypassed the human capacity to react. And that leads to an even more chilling possibility. What if the disaster wasn't a single event, but a series of failures that culminated in a moment of collective realization? Records suggest that the ship had been experiencing engine trouble for weeks. In the days leading up to the disappearance, the crew would have been working in a state of constant exhaustion, patching leaks and trying to keep the coal-fired boilers alive. The psychological toll of serving under a captain like Worley, who was known to carry a pistol and wander the ship at night, cannot be underestimated. A tired crew, a paranoid captain, and a failing ship are a recipe for a disaster that doesn't need a storm to trigger it. The Navy's official report on the matter, released months later, remains one of the most haunting documents in maritime history. It stated simply, "The disappearance of this ship has been one of the most vexing mysteries in the peasants' annals of the Navy. There have been many theories advanced, but none that satisfactorily accounts for her disappearance." But as the years turned into decades, the many theories began to coalesce into a more focused picture. Researchers started to look away from the idea of German spies and toward the very water the ship was sailing through. The Cyclops was lost in a region that would later become synonymous with maritime myth, the area between Bermuda, Florida, and Puerto Rico. While the triangle is often dismissed by modern science as a product of folklore and statistical coincidence, the Cyclops is frequently cited as the event that gave the legend its weight. However, looking at the facts, the mystery of the location might be the least interesting part of the story. The real tragedy lies in the 306 individual lives that were suspended in a state of permanent uncertainty. For the families of the crew, there was no closure, no funeral, no grave, and no final word. In the absence of facts, rumors began to fill the void, some cruel and others simply desperate. But for the families left behind, the technical details and the geopolitical theories were cold comfort. In the archives of the Navy Department, there are boxes of letters from mothers, wives, and children dated years after the disappearance. They wrote asking for any scrap of information, any personal effect, or even just a definitive statement of death so they could settle insurance claims or move on with their lives. The Navy's response remained tragically consistent. There was simply nothing to tell. One such letter came from the mother of a young sailor, asking if it was possible her son had been captured and was being held in a secret German prison camp. This hope, fueled by the lack of a wreck, persisted for years. Families clung to the idea that 306 men couldn't just vanish into thin air, that they must be somewhere waiting to be found. But as the war ended and the prisoners were repatriated, no one from the Cyclops ever emerged. The silence of the ocean was mirrored by the silence of the post-war world. And that's when a new piece of evidence surfaced in the archives, one that shifted the focus back to the ship's internal struggle. Years after the event, a former crew member who had transferred off the Cyclops just before its final voyage came forward. He described a vessel that was working in heavy seas, a term sailors use when the hull plates are shifting and the rivets are under such strain that they begin to pop. He recalled seeing water seeping through the seams of the ship, even in moderate weather. If the ship was already structurally compromised, the addition of the manganese ore wasn't just a burden, it was a ticking time bomb. Modern maritime investigators have proposed a theory that explains the lack of debris through the lens of physics. When a ship as large as the Cyclops sinks, especially one loaded with high-density ore, it creates a massive downward suction. If the hull had split in two, the heavy manganese would have acted like an anchor, dragging the steel sections down with incredible velocity. Any buoyant objects, wooden furniture, life rings, or bodies would have been trapped inside the rapidly descending hull or sucked down in the wake of the plunge. By the time the surface water settled, there would be nothing left to see. Yet, one detail remains that the back-breaking theory fails to explain entirely. The Cyclops was equipped with multiple lifeboats, and while they were secured, they were designed to float free in the event of a sinking. For not a single piece of a lifeboat to be found suggests that the ship didn't just sink. It was overwhelmed with a speed that defies standard maritime accidents. This has led some researchers to look toward rarer, more violent phenomena. Some historians believe the Cyclops may have encountered a rogue wave, a wall of water that can reach heights of 100 feet, appearing without warning even in relatively calm seas. For a ship riding as low as the Cyclops, a rogue wave hitting from the side could have capsized the vessel in seconds. With the cargo shifting simultaneously, the ship would have turned turtle and plummeted to the seabed before a single soul could reach the deck. There is no clear consensus, however, and the Navy has never officially reopened for the case. The Cyclops remains a missing vessel, its status frozen in time. In the 1920s, Assistant Secretary of the Navy Franklin D. Roosevelt took a personal interest in the case, reviewing the files in hopes of finding a missed clue. Even he, with all the resources of the government at his disposal, concluded that the mystery was impenetrable. What happened next remains unclear in terms of physical discovery, but the legacy of the Cyclops began to evolve. It became a cautionary tale for shipbuilders, leading to more rigorous standards for hull integrity and the transport of heavy ores. The Proteus class was eventually retired, but the shadow of their design flaws lived on in the naval architecture that followed. The disappearance forced the Navy to realize that even their largest, most powerful vessels were still at the mercy of the elements and the unseen rot of time. In the modern era, high-resolution sonar and deep-sea submersibles have mapped much of the Atlantic floor. We have found the Titanic, the Bismarck, and the wrecks of lost submarines. Yet, the Cyclops remains hidden. The area where it likely went down is a complex landscape of deep trenches and shifting underwater canyons. It is possible the ship lies at a depth that is currently beyond our reach, or that it has been buried under a century of silt and sediment. There is a final, more somber perspective to consider. Some believe that the mystery itself has eclipsed the tragedy. We focus on the how and the where, because the who is too painful to contemplate. 306 men, many of them teenagers, seeing the world for the first time, lost in a single, silent moment. Their stories were cut short, not by a bullet or a torpedo, but by a failure of steel and the indifference of the Atlantic. Today, there is no monument to the Cyclops other than the empty space it left in the Naval Register. The records suggest a ship that was overworked, poorly led, and fundamentally broken, yet it was sent into the most dangerous waters in the world during a time of global crisis. Perhaps the greatest mystery isn't that the ship vanished, but that we expected it to survive at all. As we look out over the horizon where the Cyclops was last seen, the water looks the same as it did in 1918, vast, restless, and deeply secretive. The ocean does not give up its ghosts easily, and it holds the secret of the USS Cyclops with a firm, cold grip. Whether the ship broke under the weight of its cargo, was claimed by a rogue wave, or suffered an internal collapse, we will never truly know. The 306 men of the Cyclops remain on their final voyage, sailing forever into the silence of history, leaving us only with the echoes of a distress call that was never sent.